Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to episode 106 of the Art of Procurement. And I've really been looking forward to sharing today's show with you for a couple of weeks since I recorded it, because back in episode 102, I welcomed Jimmy Anklesaria. Jimmy's the expert on strategic cost management. He came onto the show to talk about how we can better understand costs and specifically cost drivers to help enable fact-based pricing discussions with suppliers as part of the initial sourcing process. And I mentioned at the time that we really had too much ground to cover in a single show, and so I actually interviewed Jimmy twice over the course of a couple of weeks. And so today I'm actually sharing the second in what became a two-part series. And Jimmy and I focused today on how to strategically manage cost after the contract is signed. And I want to underline the fact that the focus really is on managing cost. It's not on managing price. And Jimmy shares really some fantastic insights along with examples, and that's really important, that are based on decades of experience helping clients around the world to solve their challenges in managing post-award costs. I really had some great feedback after the first part in the series, so I really know that you're going to love today's episode. But before I do run the tape on today's show, I do want to say a word of thanks for today's sponsor, Denali. Denali is a procurement-focused managed services provider, and they're technology agnostic, so that means that whatever your procurement technology stack is, Denali is able to support you. And they specialize in providing a variety of procurement services, including category management, sourcing, contracting, supplier management, and P2P support for Global 2000 clients across multiple different industries. And to find out more, Denali actually has a really neat explainer video, and you can find that in the sidebar on the show notes page for today's episode, and I'll give you the URL for that towards the end of the show. But I also wanted to let you know something that I've only learned about recently, and that's the Denali Training Academy. So Denali has a number of public access courses available. They're either in-person courses or online courses covering a broad range of sourcing and category management related topics. And these online courses, they start at just $120. So if you're looking for training, and specifically you're looking for online training, I'd really recommend that you go and check that out. You can head on over to artofprocurement.com/Denali training. That's artofprocurement.com/Denali training. So I'd love for you to go check it out and drop Denali a line just to thank them for their support of the Art of Procurement. I can't tell you how much of a difference that makes. Well, hi there, everybody, and as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm joined once again on the Art of Procurement by Jimmy Anklesaria. So, Jimmy, welcome back to the show.
My pleasure, Phil.
It's great to have you back again, and the last time we talked was actually only a couple of weeks ago. Back in episode 102, we focused on how to understand cost and cost drivers so you can start thinking about cost management more strategically, so that you're better prepared for what I would say fact-based negotiations with your suppliers. And so today I wanted to shift the focus a little bit, and we're doing this as a two-part discussion because I think we had too much to talk about in just one episode. And it's thinking about cost post the sourcing award. And I found out that, we don't often consider costs enough when it comes to post-sourcing. We may have a contract that maps out price over time, and if input costs increase, we benefit from that. If input costs go down, then the supplier benefits from that, and then we try and chase after them and then try and recover some of that. So I guess my first question that I'm interested in is, do you recommend that we have clauses in contracts that build flexibility into price based on changes to some of those underlying cost drivers?
Oh, absolutely. It would be unconscionable not to do that, particularly as companies begin to have longer and longer term contracts, which seems to be the mantra from all sides is long-term agreements. What I'm concerned about is companies sign up for long-term agreements, including locking in prices. And as you very correctly pointed out, that could go both ways. It could go against both. For example, if the input costs begin to skyrocket and you lock a supplier in to a given price, well, obviously, they're going to have to fulfill the contract, so they have to deliver at that same price for a higher input cost. which obviously makes you as a customer not get preferential treatment because, I mean, who wants to deal with a customer where I'm losing money every time I sell them a product or service? And on the other side, if the input costs go down, you correctly pointed out, you're off to the supplier saying, hey, you're making too much money.
Right.
So I think what we lack is something called price discipline. I think these fixed contracts tend to be what I call the lazy person approach, because you can lock it up, fall asleep, and wake up again when the contract comes due.
Yeah.
So what I'd say benchmark companies tend to do, and this you wouldn't do this on all contracts. You do this on contracts where there is certain volatility in the input costs. Okay, in which case you create what we call a price discipline model, which is to say, well, here's the price, and there's either a cost model that has been put together by the customer, or there is a certain level of openness where we agree that, look, here are the inputs, this is what it costs, here are the typical general selling, administrative, and other overheads, and here's a fair profit, and all of this can be actually tied to specific industry statistics. So it's not like arbitrary stuff. But once you set what I call a stake in the ground, the important thing is to come up with an agreement that the only thing constant is change. And so let's identify what are the items that are subject to change. For example, raw materials would clearly be one of those cases. And how shall we benchmark those against certain indices or proxy indices, item by item? Now, what you may have, and I'm sure your listeners have probably seen over their careers, generic, rather what I'd call arbitrary type mechanisms. For example, the index, which I feel is the worst index to use, the CPI, Consumer Price Index. And I cannot begin to tell you how suppliers love that, because I've never seen a consumer price index going down at the rate of 4 or 5 or 10% a year. Okay, well, in a low inflationary time, it would be like now 1.5 to 2%, and there are times when it goes 7, 8, and in some ridiculous cases, serious double digit. Now, that to me, and before I get off on the CPI, the very fact that you choose an index which represents a basket of commodities or categories that include everything from real estate, the price of milk and meat and potatoes and whatever else, and compare that to a bill of material that include semiconductors and PC boards and steel and plastics and chemicals. I mean, to me, that's outrageous. Secondly, if you said that there is a 3% inflation and you use the CPI, to keep it in a really, really simplistic form, what you're saying is every $100 price last year will now be 103 because inflation was 3%. And by doing it, I feel you have a mathematical inconsistency that says every single item on the bill of materials, every single type of labor used in the process, every manufacturing and GS&A line item have all gone up at 3%. To me, that's ridiculous. So what we recommend, so what's the alternative? It's easy to criticize the CPI. Well, what else is there? And my recommendation is the following. Either through a cost modeling effort or through some reasonable sharing of data, identify what your top 20% items are, which represent about 80% of the cost. Identify them. It could be steel. It could be within steel. It could be different types of steel, aluminum, stainless steel, things like that. Break down the bill of materials for each of the critical items on the bill of material, mutually identify what would be the best tracking mechanism for that particular type of item or category. Then determine what else changes other than market pricing. You could have exchange rates, all right? If certain items on the bill of material are exposed to any kind of exchange rate risk, well, what would be the currencies that need to be benchmarked or watched against one another? So that's another, what I'd call, tracking mechanism. Then, are there any other tracking mechanisms? Well, someone would say, well, what about productivity? How do we factor in productivity, both for material and labor? All right, so where do I get data on productivity indices? Now, all of this is available. It's not that it's unavailable. It's just that people are lazy. They don't want to go look for it. So my point is, for every major line item, identify suitable tracking mechanisms for price changes, labor rate changes, productivity improvements, exchange rates, technology, volume. You don't have to do all of the above, but depending on which ones you choose, you go ahead, start tracking, and then come up to an agreement that says, okay, we're not going to change price every day that something changes, but you can review it every, say, 3 months or 6 months, and then have another clause that says, if any of these indices move out of a certain acceptable band, then we will break that 3 or 6 months or every year review, and we will apply something immediately, because sometimes you could have an absolutely extraordinary event that sends the cost of one major item up 50%, and you certainly can't wait for the next benchmark date. So there's nothing that you cannot write into a good contract that makes it fair for both sides. And those who have used price discipline have really welcomed it, including the suppliers. They've been very open to this. They feel it's a very tough but extremely fair process.
So how do you sell something like this internally? So when I think about, and I'm thinking more in manufacturing and from my automotive days, I felt that my colleagues in finance and in sales, they hated uncertainty around pricing or costs, let's say, uncertainty around cost. And so by putting in something like this, a system like this, it means that you can never really truly forecast, over a 6 or 12 month process or period, what the cost is going to be. Whereas you take and what is, a lazier approach of, well, I've got a 5-year long-term agreement and it's going to reduce at 3% year on year, or even increase at 3% year on year. And I'm good. And that actually, I might be leaving a lot of money on the table, but everyone can at least build that into forecasting. So how do you see companies change that conversation internally to recognize that there's value in actually thinking a bit more flexibly about a long-term approach to cost?
Well, first of all, I think you were partially right in the sense no one likes uncertainty. I would venture to say that no one likes uncertainty when it is a negative variance, but they love the positive variance.
No, that's a good point.
So if prices went down, they would be delighted to take your uncertainty, but if prices go up. So my point is, if we are going to protect ourselves against uncertainty on the upside, well then, number one, you try to negotiate prices where the band is set a little wider, so that only if there is a substantial swing that is beyond our budgetary, let's say, bands, then this sort of repricing kicks in. So that's one way. The second thing would be, we are assuming that there is no other relationship with the supplier other than you sign the contract and move on. This brings us to the next part, which would be working collaboratively with suppliers, especially when there is a movement outside the band, to work with suppliers to find breakthrough ways of taking cost out of the supply chain that brings us back within those budgetary or target costs. Okay, so you have to do a combination of both. You set the bands wide enough that you do have consistency in your pricing, in your budgets, as long as it does not shoot out of certain bands. And secondly, if it does, by whatever reason, go above, no one's going to complain if it goes below. If it goes above, you immediately, this is things, and these are things you would do with or without a clause. You work with your suppliers collaboratively to find ways to get back within that particular band. And that's how the best companies do it.
It ultimately always comes back to collaboration.
Absolutely. And I'm not going to collaborate with a supplier or a customer who treats me in such a way that I lose heavily if something goes wrong that I have no control over. I'm just not going to work with that customer.
And I think we lose sight of that, especially when we work for larger organizations. Again, I'm thinking of my own experiences. And, you brought up in those environments to believe that it's all about power dynamics and leverage and the fact that I work for, a $50 billion revenue company, so I have the power in the discussion. And at the end of the day, that's not how you're actually building those relationships with suppliers to enable them to be a lot more flexible in their approach to you, and to be able to provide some of the things that you're asking for rather than just pushing down and kind of banging the table with them.
Absolutely. Amen. Yep.
This episode of The Art of Procurement was made possible by support from Denali. And Denali specialises in providing a variety of procurement services, including category management, sourcing, contracting, supplier management, and P2P for Global 2000 clients across multiple industries. And as a buyer and provider of procurement managed services, I know that you only get one chance of making a first impression, both with client executives but also with key stakeholders, and how you approach the rollout of your new relationship truly is critical. And so I recently talked with Shari Thomas. Shari is a manager at Denali with responsibility for launching new client programs.
So my name is Shari Thomas, and my title is manager. I typically am on the initial team assigned to new clients to build a relationship with them and to help implement their program.
I asked Shari to share with me one of the keys to a successful implementation.
I think it's important for Denali to understand the culture of the organizations we represent. When we go in to work with a client, demonstrating that we understand their challenges goes a long way toward helping us integrate with the team. And of course, we need to deliver excellent results based upon the client needs. We have several formal training programs for learning about working with people that have different styles. And those programs have been tremendously beneficial in helping the team adapt to different clients.
So when you need a procurement managed services provider that hits the ground running by focusing on your needs from day one, talk to Denali. To find out more, visit www.denaliusa.com. So I know that one of the things that you do, you're traveling the world really, sharing and educating organizations on how to think more strategically about cost when you really the whole continuum, but specifically for today, thinking about post-contract award. And you have the aim and drive process that you developed. Now, I don't necessarily want you to go into all the nuts and bolts of it because I don't want you to give away all of your secret sauce on the show. But I'd just love if you could share a little bit of information, like at a higher level of what aim and drive, first of all, what it's all about. What are some of the things that go into it? And how is that helping organizations think differently about cost?
Well, sure, and I'm certainly not going to bore your listeners with the detail here, but I think a couple of examples would pretty much make the case.
Sure.
Now, aim and drive is an acronym, AIMDRIVE, like a process.
Yeah.
And you could say that there are other things like Six Sigma and Lean and value engineering, etc., that could all be considered what we call post-award. So let's just take a step back. The earlier discussion on cost modeling, price discipline, and all these different methodologies are useful in creating what hopefully is a very competitive price.
Yeah.
Let's make it clear. It's a
Yeah.
very competitive price by analyzing the elements of cost that make up the price. But once you've got that contract in place, you've locked in the rates and things like that, I haven't seen any company say, well, that's great, now fall asleep until the next contract comes due. Generally, it is, okay, you've done this, you've done all your analytics, you've done whether it was competitively bidding it out, whether it was using cost models to negotiate with the fewer suppliers, that's irrelevant. The question is, what do you do once the contract is signed? And those companies that I would refer to as the pedigree lot, those who believe in breakthrough, those that believe in collaborative efforts, they then switch gears, and now the focus on the supplier is to get into demand and specification and not on price.
Yeah.
Now, there are companies, particularly in the oil and gas industry, they love this. It's called 40-40-20 or 20-40-40, depending on which way you put it. But basically saying that in the total cost of ownership model, you spend 20% of your time and effort and resources negotiating price.
Yeah.
You spend 40% of your time and resources on demand, and the last on specification. Let me give you an example of both demand and specification in one example using Mandroid. So Mandroid, by definition, is a collaborative effort to take cost out of the supply chain.
Yeah.
Later, once costs are out of the supply chain, buyer and seller can figure out who gets what part of the savings. But I'm a strong believer, first save the money and then talk. So it begins with an agreement that we are here to manage cost, not negotiate price. That's the first thing.
Yep.
We need to make sure we involve the business stakeholders. We need to bring in the supplier, operational people, finance people. And with due respect, I mean, I'm not here to say don't have a salesperson, but this is not a place where the salesperson is going to be adding the most value.
Right.
This is where we are rolling up our sleeves on both sides. The customer,
design and operations.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got the R&D folks, we've got the engineering people, we've got the finance people from both sides. So we set our goals. We set our goals from different perspectives. It's not just reduce cost. It could be improving quality, pushing technology, delivery on time, etc., environmental, conflict minerals, you name it. There are many goals that go into a business, not just my financial goals.
Yeah.
Once we've done that, I is to identify critical costs in the supply chain. Now, this is where collaboration really proves whether it's genuine or fake, because now we're not talking about going back to negotiate. So both sides have to be aware of it. The supplier is putting certain costs on the table, identifying the critical costs. You don't have to give the end-to-end 100%, but if you can account for about 60 to 70%, that's good enough for us to move to the next step.
Right.
And the buyers have to be very, very disciplined to make sure they don't go back and say, oh, wait a minute, now, is that the number? Oh, that's too high, and let's go renegotiate the price. They'll be very disciplined. The price is set. Now let's move on. N is to measure cost in a totally different way. Unlike the old days where measuring cost was left to the cost accountants of the world, and you had things like standard cost, process cost, activity-based costs, etc. Now I'm pushing companies to think of measuring cost where you create a cause and effect relationship. So visualize the second part of Mandroid, identifying critical cost. The cost is the result of the equation. On the right-hand side of every equation, you have a number of variables. If you were to visualize an algebraic equation, on the right-hand side, you have variables. Consider the variables as cost drivers. So to give you a physical example, I mean, right now, I'm using a mobile phone, and I've got a battery charger because my battery was pretty low, and I've got a battery charger that's plugged into the wall. And this battery charger is, when I look at the distance, I'm looking at probably close to 2 meters of cable length. So visualize a handset manufacturer, part of their accessories that they buy in tens or hundreds of millions, depending on the company, they buy hundreds of millions of cable to be put into a kit that then is sold along with the handset. Now, let's just visualize the kit costs. Let's say the cable costs, let's say $1, just for the heck of it. And the entire cable with the connectors is $1.50 or $2. Let's just focus on the cable for a moment, Phil, and your listeners. Visualize you locked in the cable, and let's just arbitrarily say it's $1, and you are the best buyer in the world, and you're the biggest $50 billion company or few $100 billion company, it's irrelevant, and you feel there is no one who can give me a cheaper cable than this, so what can you do? This is an example that I actually ran with one of the largest, or the largest handset manufacturer in the world many moons ago. They're not there anymore, but you may get the drift.
Yeah.
And we look at it and say, okay, it's a $1 cable. What can you do? But if you think of measuring cost in this way that I call formula-based costing, where you feel, let's write a formula for it. So if I were to write a formula for cable where the end result is the number of dollars per year, $200 million, $400 million a year is the total cable, you write a formula that says, okay, what is this equal to? How is cable purchased? Dollar per meter. Okay, now what next? Because it's now dollars per year is not equal to dollars per meter. It's out of balance.
Right.
So you say, well, it's the number of meters per roll because it's sold to you as a roll. Then each roll so from each roll, number of rolls per number of pieces or cut pieces.
Yeah.
Right? Number of cut pieces per number of good cut pieces. Then what do you do with a good cut piece? Well, we put it into an assembly. So number of good cut pieces per number of assemblies. Well, number of assemblies per number of good assemblies. Number of good assemblies per number of handsets made. Number of handsets made per handsets sold. Number of handsets sold per year. Now, this looks like a huge bunch of words, etc. Right. But think of what I'm doing.
Yeah. I'm
creating a cause and effect relationship that says, if you want the left-hand side to change the $200-400 million of spend on cable, if you want that number to change, one or more of the variables have to change on the right-hand side. Now, if you took the first one, I'm going to read just a couple of these to you. So the first one I said is dollars per meter. That would be the cable price.
Yeah.
Number of meters per roll, that tells me the size of the roll. Number of rolls per number of cut pieces, that tells me the cable length. Watching it?
Yeah.
Now, the next one is number of cut pieces per good cut pieces. That would be your cutting yield. Good cut pieces per assembly, that's a requirement.
Yeah.
Assemblies per good assemblies, that's your final assembly yield, and so on. So the point now is at the end of the third step, you're beginning to have a causal relationship. What causes the cable to be 200 million or 300 million or 150 million? Well, one, we could sell less handsets, make less kits,
right,
use less cable. Well, that's a kind of pretty stupid way to go about doing business, right? I can make it zero by not selling any handsets.
Right. Unless you're losing money on cable. Unless you're losing money on every handset.
Right. So let's focus on more realistic things. We've said the dollar per meter, I'm getting the best price, I've negotiated it, I've done all my cost modeling, etc. We're not going to revisit that. This is a post-award contract. Next, the number of meters per roll, that's the roll size. By making it smaller rolls or larger rolls, it's not going to change the number of meters of cable that I buy.
Yeah.
Number of rolls per number of cut pieces. This tells me for a roll of 1,000 meters, do I get 400 cut pieces? If so, it tells me the average cable length is 2.5 meters. Let's go deeper into that. That would be the D. D is for defining the key cost driver. Now I'm zooming in on one of those drivers that I believe we could do something. On the next one, R is to reduce, eliminate, or change. So I've got to reduce, eliminate, change, modify, do something about the size of the cable length. Well, in this case, the suggestion would be, let's reduce it. Why do we need 2.5 meters?
Yeah.
Where am I 2.5 meters away from an outlet?
Right.
And if so, if I am, well, then I just go to that outlet and I leave my phone like we do at the airports. You go to the pillar against the wall, you stick your phone in there, and you probably flop down next to the pillar and read a book.
Right. It's not going to change your buying decision of that handset how long the wire is or the cable is to your phone, is it?
So now you're beginning to see what we're trying to do here is, why couldn't we reduce it, let's just for the heck of it say, by 50%?
Yeah.
We're not affecting the technology, we're not affecting the quality, we've not gone to a cheaper cable from a unqualified supplier. We are absolutely with the same spec, but we've changed the demand. Because now my demand has dropped by 50%. Yes, there may be a risk of doing that. The price may go up a little bit because my volumes have gone down, but certainly the price is not going to go up 50%. So that's the R. You reduce, eliminate, change. You do your risk analysis. I is for implement. You're implementing what, who, when. And then V is for verify. Did you actually change the spec? Is the new spec now 1.25 meters? Has the old quantity been pushed through the inventory all the way through production? Is the new quantity coming in now? at a 1.25 meter cut, and so on. So just making sure project management, you're verifying what you've done. And E is for eternal improvement. So let's take a quick swing around. In the case of a cable, you've also got connectors on either side. So the first one, I gave you a demand idea. Now let me give you a specification idea. And in this particular case, we looked at the connectors. Let's say they're 20-cent connectors. The single largest cost of the connector is the gold plating on every little pin on that connector. It's plated with gold. So as we run this scenario again through the M, the list of cost drivers, no one's going to be changing the price of gold in a hurry, especially as a buyer of connectors. You don't really influence the gold market.
Right.
But what you could do is, as we go through the formula, you come up with what we call the plating thickness, the number of micro milliliters of gold dispersed on each pin, then of course the number of pins in a connector. So one thing could be to reduce the number of pins, but that's not going to help you that much. The better thing to do would be to focus on the gold and reduce the thickness of coating on each pin. Now, that has a risk, because when I challenged the company that we were dealing with, one of the risks would be that if you reduce the plating thickness, the pull test requirements, so you're doing a test that says, I insert and I pull, I insert and I pull. And every time you pull, you're doing a little friction that ultimately the connectivity is affected. But if I questioned, and in this particular case I did, the pull test requirement was 50,000. And my humble response was, who charges their phone 50,000 times?
Right.
Because even if you charged your phone twice a day, which in today's better battery life and longer battery life, you don't even need to charge it twice a day. But even assuming you did, that's 730 times a year, 365 days, twice.
Right.
Or even if you did it 3 times, you're looking at a little over 1,100 or so.
Yeah.
And a typical phone, 2, 3, 4 years maybe, and I mean, after that, you're really a dinosaur. So why would you want more than 5,000 pulls? So we call the supplier, we say, look, if I change this pull test requirement and you use less gold, how much would that change on a connector? And let's say it's 5 cents a connector, and you're making 200 million of these. You've just pulled a few $1 million out by changing the specification, which in this case was changing a pull test requirement. So that's an example of how Aim and Drive works on the product side, and the exact same thing works on the services. And a very quick example would be when working with a large computer company and their advertising agency, a major cost of the creative side of the advertising agency was the creative directors and the draftsmen and stuff like that. And these are extremely highly paid people. And in this particular company, using the same concept, the single largest cost was the people cost, obviously. A little bit of software, but mostly people cost. And so now you're looking at daily rates. And it gets a little sensitive, not impossible, but sensitive. We use cost models, etc., to validate the daily rate. But typically, especially when you're dealing with an ad agency and you want the particular director, Joe or Jill, you want that person. And the last thing in the world you want to do is to go in there and say, I'd like to negotiate that person's salary down by 50%.
Right.
You're going to really upset them. And you're not going to get.
And your marketing people.
Yeah, and you're not going to get the right people.
Right.
They're going to give you the B team.
Right.
So we're saying, take price out of the equation, 20, 40, 40. Take price, 20%. We're not talking about price. The rate is fixed. Let's write a formula, dollars per hour, number of hours paid per number of hours worked per, let's call it, per draft, number of drafts per number of approved drafts, all the way to an actual ad being locked in. Now, what we found in this particular incident was, or in this particular case study, was the number of times, the number of iterations, they call them briefs in the advertising world, the number of briefs that were made by the creative team to put before the customer, and then the customer says, well, I like this brief, but I don't like this color of blue, or that shade of red, or this person in the background. And they keep changing and changing and changing and changing. So we zoomed in on the number of changes in these briefs that caused the number of hours to increase, that in turn obviously cost more labor dollars. So this was a function of the number of people at the customer side who had the authority to overrule on a brief.
Okay.
Believe it or not, this is a global company. If you counted individuals, there were about 200 individuals with the power to make a change.
Yeah.
We brought it down to 3 people, one in the United States, one in EMEA, which is Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and one in Asia. 3 people, you're the head of your team, you are the only one who can make a change. We brought the briefs down by 60%, and we brought a $100 million project down by about 35, to about 35, 40. We took out about $65 million on a $100 million project. It became a benchmark. It became a standard. Okay? So that's kind of aim and drive. Now, this will not work unless you have the full support of your business unit. You don't want procurement people to go out, try to do something, and the business says, nope, it's okay, I'm not going to change. At the same time, you need the full collaboration and cooperation of the supplier team and a culture. It has to be a culture that encourages and rewards ideas. You don't want a supplier to be in a culture that if they gave you an idea, you take it, you incorporate it, you take the savings and say thank you. Well, thank you is great, but thank you and a little bit of financial bonus would also be better.
Right. And there's actually, I had a question about, so you mentioned it right at the very top when you started to explain aim and drive, and you talked about the fact that, you know, you think about how you reward the parties. You want to find the costs to save first before you really think about how you reward based on what the outcome was. But what kind of split do you see is typical, or how do companies help to incentivize their suppliers to actually engage in a process like this? Do they give 50% of the savings back to them, or is it a case-by-case basis? It depends on what you're buying, what the outcome is, what you find.
Having done this for now 20-some years, it's pretty obvious that I've seen every end-to-end of the spectrum. But let me offer what I call is fair. 50-50 is not necessarily fair, even though it sounds very fair. Mm-hmm. We do have to understand we're in a business. This is not some kind of a charity organization where we say you keep half and I'll keep half. What I see is the following. First, we've got to be open and honest as to what we want the target cost to be. And it's not 20% lower because my boss says so. That is the most, that's the lamest of all. And yet it's the most popular one. What I want is to be open and honest. If I'm a buyer, I want to be open and honest with my supplier, share with them my product goals or my service goals with my customer, my price targets, what I need to do and why I need to do this new price. And then say, okay, now let's just, for the sake of arguments, say that there's $1 million that we need to pull out in order for us to meet our target. So we sit down with the supplier where the understanding is, instead of going to the supplier and say, give me $1 million reduction, let's assume it's a $10 million contract, and you've used good logic, you've shared it, it's not an arbitrary number picked out of the sky, it's $1 million target, and the supplier understands, thank you for sharing it with me. I understand you've got $1 million target. Now we work together using aim and drive, and we find $1 million of savings, cost avoidance, whatever they agree upon. In the agree stage, where we agreed and set our goals, we agreed the first $1 million goes to the customer because that's what we need to literally be there to fight another day.
Right.
Then after the $1 million, it's totally, up to the team. And I don't say 50-50. Typically, after that, if 10% of the savings could go down to the supplier, they would be thrilled. In some cases, it's 50-50, no problem. Now, before I get off this topic, it goes the other way as well. And I'd like to share with you a specific example from a large computer company in the chemicals category. So they were buying chemicals, And I distinctly remember the supplier of the chemical company was present, very collaborative, very cooperative, ready, eager, willing to work. I remember with pride the head of that category, the chemical category, who came into the room. The supplier had absolutely shown all their costs, total open book, and it was clear that the supplier was losing $1 million for every year that they supplied this product to this customer.
Yeah.
And I was so proud to hear the buyer customer, the category manager, saying, they've been pretty clear. We've challenged them, so their numbers are approved. The first $1 million we take out, 100% goes to the supplier.
Right.
And he came back at the end of the workshop to make sure, because we did save well in excess of $1 million, but he made sure the first $1 million went to the supplier, and then the balance was split 90-10, where 90% came to the customer, and the supplier got a little bit of an incentive to get another 10% on the savings. So to me, that is pedigree, Phil. That is pedigree.
Yeah, and you don't often hear stories like that where, that truly is thinking about the greater good of the partnership rather than just trying to take advantage of one party or the other. You talked about the fact that supplier opened their books, and does this require open book costing to really be to kind of maximize the benefit of going through this process?
Not necessarily. In fact, I talked about an open book only because they were losing so much money, they put everything on the table. Now, normally to run a good aim and drive exercise, you don't need to have open book. I want to make sure suppliers in particular hear this. What we need is to identify critical costs. We don't need all your costs. So I go back to an adage that I've used for many, many years. It's better to be approximately correct than to be exactly wrong. So I don't need a spreadsheet with 300 line items, each one going into 17 decimal point accuracy. I mean, it's just irrelevant. What we do need is the top 4 or 5 items that constitute a significant part of this total price. So if we can choose, and even within those, I don't need to be exact. So for example, if there are 2 raw materials that are significant and constitute 25% in one case and 16% in the other case, I'm looking at 41% in these 2. Now, I don't really care, is it 41% or is it 45% or is it 38%? The fact is 40% plus or minus a little bit. Let's take these 2, write the formula, investigate it, look at the key cost drivers, strategic options, risk analysis, implementation. Then, as part of internal improvement, let's take the next 2 that constitute maybe collectively 18 or 20%. Same thing. I don't really care if it's 18 or 20 or 21 or 16. So the important thing is to have that openness that you don't send us on a wild goose chase by putting an item that we go all the way and save 50%, and then you say, well, that was 2% of my price. And you just say 50%. That would be very disheartening, and the supplier likely will never be invited to participate in this again. And out comes the hatchet, and you're going to be told reduce 10%, and I don't give a damn where you get the 10%. You want it to be something where the supplier felt there was value in collaborating, and the buyer felt that at the end of the day it was valuable to them as well. As I said, if I spent a couple of weeks with a supplier and I got a 50% savings, only then to be told that it was on 1% of the cost, I'm going to be pretty ticked off.
Yeah, and then you haven't got both parties entering into it in the spirit of which you're trying to bring everyone together.
Right.
I wanted to circle back to something you said a little earlier, and you talked about the fact that getting suppliers getting suppliers engaged is critical, but also your stakeholders engaged. And, I'm thinking in some cases there's a burning platform, there's a recognition that we need to change, and the stakeholders may be, welcoming this process with open arms. But other times it's procurement initiated, and the stakeholders may be thinking, well, I don't really need to change anything because everything's working as far as I'm concerned. So how have you seen companies be successful in bringing stakeholders on board to a process like this where they were really reticent to do so?
Well, first of all, I've never really seen anyone so open to change, except perhaps a wet baby. But But change is something that has to be from a leadership. That's a leadership responsibility. And in most cases that have been successful, it's because the leadership has not only promoted this type of culture, but has participated. So I've seen it on both sides. I've seen it where companies' leaders have gone and benchmarked other companies, come back and said, we've got to do aim and drive. It worked at company A, B, and C, and we're going to drive it through. And I've seen in the company that I benchmarked, they got 20, 30% cost savings, cost avoidance. They saved $1 billion. I want to do the same thing too. Yeah. They form a committee, they form a group, they bark out orders from head office and say, you will do this. And then 6 months later, they are furious that they're not seeing the type of money that they saw at the benchmark company.
Yeah.
Now, what's missing is if I were to tell them, well, take a look at the benchmark company. The CEO, CFO, the head of procurement, the head of the business general managers supported something. At every single aim and drive with the key suppliers, they had a vice president, a general manager, kicking it off, welcoming the suppliers, challenging them, sharing some of the company goals. Now, what's the difference? One side was all talk and no do.
Right.
The second one was I show my involvement, I show my interest. And I've got a client in the Middle East, in Oman, that I absolutely tip my hat to. At virtually every single major aim and drive session, the technical director, I mean, this is a person who reports directly to the CEO. The technical director personally sits in. In fact, the first 3 or 4, he sat through the entire workshop, participating like any other member.
Right.
And then later on coming in to kick it off and perhaps close it at the end. Now, that level of commitment, they save something like 20-some% in an already tight market. And to me, I would say full kudos to the technical director, the financial director, and of course, the managing director himself. So that's the thing. It's leadership. If I were to put one word, it's leadership or the lack thereof.
And as we come to wrap up, unfortunately, we're bouncing against time here. And my final question was around, and I think it's really a leadership-based question, that as you walk into an organization that's kind of figuring out what to do for the first time, maybe they've engaged you to take a look around and give them some recommendations on how they can improve from a cost management perspective. What's the one thing that's missing, or that you think that they need to focus on this first before they've really got a chance of thinking strategically about managing their costs? Is there one commonality between most of your clients or prospects when you talk to them for the first time?
I need 2 words for that, and that's inherent capability.
Yeah.
Inherent capability. I'm a strong believer, Phil, that people in an organization have inherent capability. And you have got to break this culture of running out to a consultant all the time. Mm-hmm. So I think if there is a solution to someone who may approach me, my recommendation is aim and drive is designed to build and implement inherent capability. Yes, I don't ever want to come across as being a consultant. We are educators. My process is there to educate them. They use the process, and it's their internal and inherent capability that drives breakthrough solutions. The process just helps them. So my advice to any leader is stop looking outside.
Yeah.
You have got inherent talent, and if you don't, then invest a very modest amount of money to train your people versus paying outrageous money to consultants who come in, talk to those very same people, get the ideas, and give it back to you. I think that's unconscionable.
Yeah, and institutionalizing, I think that's one of the things that I see. My background for part of my career was in outsourcing and organizations who would outsource a lot of their strategic work in procurement. But what they didn't do is capture the knowledge that was kind of shared with them throughout that process. So you get to the end of an agreement, and they still, with the same challenges they had on day one of, an expensive engagement at the end of that engagement, because they never really learned from what they could take from the service provider to build that internally.
Exactly.
Well, Jimmy, I want to thank you very much for joining me again. I think it's been a couple of hours worth of conversations, and I could ask a lot more information, a number of more questions. But I just think that some of these examples as well, really, to me, when I think about cost management, I've always thought about it with more of a manufacturing hat on than a services hat. So it's really interesting to start thinking about how we can apply some of these same concepts to services that we do to manufacturing, where, we kind of think of things as being a lot more specification driven rather than solution driven. So my very, very last question, and this is the easy one, is where can listeners kind of find out a little bit more if they want to learn about Aim and Drive in a little bit more detail, or if they just want to contact you or one of your peers at Anklesaria Group?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for giving me this opportunity, Phil. I enjoyed chatting with you and your audience. If anyone wants to find a little bit more about us, about this methodology, about the I'd say the tens of companies that have successfully implemented it. I call them the Pedigree Group. Mm-hmm. They can always go to the website. It's www.anklesaria.com, and that's spelled ANKLESARIA, Anklesaria.com. You can always go on Amazon or any of these places to get the book. It's called Supply Chain Cost Management: The Aim and Drive Process for Achieving Extraordinary Results by Jimmy Anklesaria. And I would be delighted to, share more stories and experiences and what to do and what not to do. To me, it's a passion, and I hope I can spread that around the world.
Well, Jimmy, thanks. I mean, what I'm going to do is I'll link up to the website and also to the books through Amazon. I'm going to put those at the show notes for today's episode, and that's going to be artofprocurement.com/post-award cost. That's artofprocurement.com/post-award cost. So just one final time, Jimmy, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.